Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to number 9 episode of Divesoft Dive Talks Live. Hello to everyone that's joining us from all over the world. Looks like we have folks from Berlin, UK, California, and even Malaysia. We're here in Tampa Bay, Florida. So this week, my guest is one of the most awarded and professionally recognized divers in the world, Geoff Bozanic. Geoff Bozanic is a technical diving instructor and research scientist. Based in Southern California, Geoff is the president of Next Generation Services, where he provides consulting and training services in the diving market. He's probably best known for his textbook on the topic, Mastering Rebreathers. I know I'm a big fan of the book, and I always make sure all my students, they go through it and read it. It's a fantastic textbook. Geoff, as a marine scientist, has participated and led over 60 diving expeditions during the past 40 years to places as far and wide as Palau, the Canary Islands, and the Yucatan Peninsula. His scientific diving began in 1978 from Humboldt State University, and he's published on many diving education topics. He serves on the TDI Advisory Panel Committee and assisting with the review of diving procedures and standards. Geoff holds an MBA in International Marketing, a PhD in Education, and spent another 3 years in PhD level studies in his marine geochemistry. His contributions to underwater science were recognized by the American Academy of Underwater Sciences, the Conrad Limbaugh Award for Scientific Diving Leadership in 2015. So to say that he's a very accomplished scientific diver is an understatement. So see if we can have Matt pipe him in now. All right. Hello, Geoff.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, fantastic to have you. Thanks for joining us all the way from the West Coast. Good morning.
It's morning here. It's afternoon where you are, isn't it?
Yep, we're at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So.
The joys of modern technology.
Right. Yeah, we've got folks joining us all the way from Malaysia, Berlin. So it's this is a fantastic tool to bring people together when we have to be inside, right?
I think it's a great thing for us to be doing. It's a nice way for us to still have community and to be able to, learn more and participate in some way, at least, in that sport that we all love.
Exactly. It's such a social sport. We're such a tightly knit community, and so we've got friends like Michael Menduno saying hello, and then it's been really good to keep in touch with everyone.
Hey, Michael, it's good to hear from you.
He joined us a couple weeks ago. He showed us some cool videos from the good old days.
He's old enough to remember them. I'm still way too young for that.
Oh, there you go. Exactly. So, so you have such a fantastic background, and I know my background is I came kind of from science diving and academic diving as well. And so, to kind of just dive straight in, tell us a little bit about how you got into scuba diving, being from California, and then how'd you get into it?
It's pretty ironic, actually. I wanted to learn to dive when I used to watch Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And I always wanted to have like a yellow wetsuit or a red wetsuit like the Admiral and the Captain in the show. And I just thought that was like really cool. When I was in high school, like many people that are in high school, especially nerds, we had to do PE every day. And I detested physical education. It was my least favorite topic. And one year they offered scuba diving as an alternative to physical education. I didn't have to play ball. I didn't have to play catch. I could go out and learn to dive. And so I took my first diving class through my high school in lieu of phys ed. And quite frankly, I learned pretty much absolutely nothing. We never went in the pool. We did a couple lectures sitting on the bleachers out by the track, and then we went out to the ocean and we went diving. We did 3 dives, but for me, I was hooked. I thought that was really cool, and I thought it was exciting, and so I just kept learning from there. I just kept going.
Wow, yeah, that's a I think things are a little bit different than they were then, but I mean that what a way to learn. It's just like, oh yeah, let's go diving, and so just keep breathing, and go slowly.
That was pretty much it. And even on I think it was my second dive, I discovered my first treasure underwater. We were diving the breakwater at Big Corona, which is a local park here in Southern California, place where there's tons and tons of people, and I found a brand new dive knife lying on the bottom. And so that was my first recovery.
It was a symbol of things to come, right?
Apparently. I've been collecting stuff ever since. My wife would say junk, and I would say treasures, but you know what they say, one man's garbage is another man's treasure.
Oh, yeah. No, I have lots of scuba diving junk, and, it's just growing and growing and growing.
So, and then from there, I actually took a second introductory class, basic scuba class, from my physics professor, John Wozni, in high school, and then took an advanced diving class at the local junior college, even though I wasn't full-time in college yet at that point in time. And so I took continuing education classes that filled in the gaps in my knowledge on the first class I took, and kept me active and going diving on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's such a good resource. It seems like, it's so close, and you have shore diving, so you don't have to worry about boats. You can just go snorkeling and go diving right from the beach.
Well, and at that point in time too, I wasn't old enough to drive, and so I had to rely on other people to drive me. I think they just threw up a slide of one of my early training classes. When I started college, I started at UC Irvine and eventually dropped out, quote unquote, and ended up at Santa Ana College, which is a community college here. And I went there specifically because they had a dive program, a degree program, an associate's degree program in underwater occupations. And so my first degree was an AA in underwater occupations that I got at Santa Ana College. And we ended up, I spent a year and a half in the program there. We ended up working with literally hundreds of students during that time. And the curriculum was all kinds of different classes. It was classes in underwater hunting and collecting, underwater photography, equipment maintenance, search and recovery. And so all of these different specialty classes, which were being offered through NOAA, the National Association of Underwater Instructors, as part of the program there, were the required classes that I took in order to be able to get my degree. And then eventually you went all the way up through assistant instructor and instructor, and went through an ITC, an instructor training course. And that was where I became a dive instructor, was through that program. At that time, I wasn't actually old enough to be an instructor yet. I finished my ITC in 1978, and I was only 20 years old. And so I had to wait until I turned 21 before they would actually let me register as an instructor at that point in time.
Wow, how interesting! I know where I went to school at Texas A&M, we have a dive program. We have a dive program there, and it's a very similar pipeline. And we also taught it through NOAA, and NOAA's fantastic training agency with universities, and so and you do it over a good amount of time, like you said, several years. And so we did the same thing at Texas A&M, and I really commend programs that do that, because it really teaches a very students get very multifaceted approaches, and they can really take their time to really learn the things in detail.
Well, that's actually one of the things that's changed a lot in the diving community that I've seen over the oh God, this is going to sound really bad, nearly 50 years that I've been diving. I was certified originally in 1972, so I'm 2 years away from my 50-year mark.
All right.
But the point is that despite the class that I went through early, most of my training was through the university system, colleges and universities, and those programs were quite comprehensive. You took an entry-level class, and that entry-level class might have involved doing a dozen dives. And the number of dives that are required for training, while they've hovered between 3 and 5 dives for years, but the point is that the classes appear to be getting compressed, and you don't spend as much time with the students as we used to. And the university classes were really good for that. And part of the reason for that is that diving was perceived not only recreationally, it was considered to be a tool for other things you might be doing. And that really is what differentiates scientific diving from recreational diving, is that with recreational diving, we're out there to go diving. We're out there to have a good time. We're out there to be underwater. With scientific diving, the point is not to go out there just to have fun. The point is to go out there and get some work done. And so we utilize it as a tool to be able to go to where we actually need to do our work, whether that work is looking at animals and doing observations, collecting samples for, animals or rocks or plants, doing underwater archaeological work, doing water chemistry work, whatever that work is. It's just a mechanism to be able to get us underwater, to be able to where we can actually do something else. And that's probably the biggest difference. And it's also one of the reasons why the scientific diving programs in particular are much longer and much more varied in terms of the types of skills and the types of things that you practice and that you do in a course.
Exactly. The scientific diving, it's classified, it's as kind of working diving, but it's operates under different auspices than, like, say, OSHA or commercial diving. And the scientific dive, it's predominantly, as you said, a tool to use scuba diving as a tool to collect data, to observe underwater, and to, like you said, collect, get work done.
Yeah.
And
in fact, in scientific diving in the United States, we actually fall under an exemption from the OSHA subpart T standards that commercial divers follow. But in other countries, that's not true. In other countries like Australia or England, scientific divers fall under the same commercial diving regulations that their commercial divers do. And so the way that scientific diving is perceived or pursued around the planet varies based on where you happen to live or where you happen to be working.
Yeah, and those changes can mean a lot. Versus having a dive supervisor, having a chamber on board, that can be very difficult for, if you're trying to collect data in a very remote area using, say, techniques like caves, or using technology like rebreathers. A lot of PIs or principal investigators don't have the resources to kind of support it in that endeavor.
Well, and that's one of the changes that have certainly taken place over the last. I started doing my scientific diving work in 1978, maybe. Originally at Humboldt State University, and then in other places beyond that. But a lot of those things that you just mentioned, doing research in underwater cave systems, using rebreathers to do work, using different types of gas mixtures for working underwater, those really weren't permissible at that point in time under the scientific diving standards of those days. And that's one of the big changes that I've seen in the scientific diving community over the last 30 years.
Yeah, it's standards for a lot of that type of diving were, it was just kind of a very fringe activity to be doing. And so,
quite frankly, I didn't finish my first PhD in oceanography because, in large part, I was violating all of the university's diving standards. I wasn't supposed to be diving in caves. I wasn't supposed to be doing decompression diving. I wasn't supposed to be diving with non-university affiliated personnel. I wasn't supposed to be using double tanks. That probably I could have gotten permission for, but those were all prohibited activities in the day.
Yeah, or voodoo gas, otherwise known as nitrox.
Well, and in large part, I became more involved in the American Academy of Underwater Sciences, specifically in those days, to be able to develop standards under which I was able to do the kind of work I wanted to do underwater and still have it be legal or legitimate, because those standards that kind of diving just wasn't allowed. And so a lot of my early talks at AAUS meetings were developmental standards for doing these kinds of divings and getting them reviewed and marketing them essentially to other diving officers and other scientific divers across the country.
Yeah, and they can see that, like, okay, now we're doing this type of diving. We're starting to establish standards. This is how we can do it safely and properly. So,
you know, and we've learned a lot of lessons in those days. And I think that the scientific diving community has progressed leaps and bounds from where it was when I was a graduate student, which is good.
Yeah, we have you sent us a lot of pictures of kind of your process and your growth going through there, and we have some pictures of you, doing your work in the Bahamas and the biogeochemistry of it, and then kind of the timeline of it.
Yeah, it's for me, I'd have to say that my success, as it were, has really been based on writing technology and utilizing that technology to be able to collect data that scientists really hadn't been able to collect very effectively before, because they just didn't have the tools to be able to do that. And so part of it is training, personal training. Part of it is development of standards, allowing us to be able to dive with a reasonable degree of risk, measured, thinking about things that can go wrong and trying to plan around those types of problems, and improvement in equipment, that have allowed us to do things that we just couldn't do before.
Now, and so that's really interesting, because we're seeing a big leaps and bounds in, like, at least me in cave country, or around here in Florida, is that I see a lot of folks on rebreathers now, and so rebreathers were considered pretty taboo then. And so, do you think that kind of philosophy has changed a lot more than it used to be, or is it still kind of taboo in the science diving realms?
It's getting better. Better meaning, from my perspective, I think it's becoming more accepted. With any new technology, there is lack of knowledge equates to fear,
right?
And not wanting to adopt technology because people tend to be risk adverse. And the scientific diving community, my opinion is, used to be much more embracing of allowing people to be a little bit more edgy, as it were, with the diving that they were doing, because it was pretty much scientists that were running things and developing the rules and wanting to go out and push limits and wanting to go out and collect new data and wanting to go out places where they couldn't go before. And then as standards became more codified, and universities started to have programs as opposed to just a couple of, universities, one here and one there, risk managers got more involved and administrators got more involved in how the programs were run. And what that meant was that the types of activities became not just more structured, but people were steered away from things that were considered to be risky. And if you didn't know how something worked, or you didn't have a great deal of operational history, people didn't want to be the first ones to do it, because people get hurt, and that doesn't look good. And, it's not good for the university. It's not good for the department, and nobody wants that to happen. I mean, it wasn't like people went out and said, "Okay, let's go get somebody hurt today."
Let's go get hurt, right?
We were learning a lot of lessons, and so rebreathers are still in that state right now. There are more universities that are picking them up. And in fact, if you go back 10 years, there was very few people that were using them in an academic setting. There are many more people using them in an academic setting now, but there's still a lot of diving officers or a lot of university programs that don't have as much knowledge in the field as they could have. And it's not their fault. It's just, it's not available in a lot of places, and it's expensive institutionally. And so a lot of institutions don't have the money to be able to spend, not only to buy the equipment, but also to get the training that's necessary to even be able to make the judgment as to whether that's a direction that they want to go.
Exactly, that initial investment in there.
So it's better, but I wouldn't say it's totally accepted yet either. And the same thing is true in the recreational industry. If you go into the average dive shop, most of them will look at you and they'll say, we don't know anything about this. You go over there and we're going to stay over here.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that's also changing. And the same thing was true of nitrox. And now almost everybody adopts nitrox. But when I wrote the first couple of articles that I did on nitrox, Skin Diver magazine came out and said, you know, this is a voodoo gas. We can't be using this. This isn't for the recreational dive community at all. You know, like, stay away. And that's changed. You know, now almost everybody embraces nitrox, and they see the physiological benefits, especially for the older people like me, in terms of being able to help us stay healthy. And the same thing is happening with rebreathers, but the adoption is slow. And it was slow with the nitrox as well. But in another 10 years, we're going to look back on this and say, boy, what were those people thinking?
Yeah, hindsight's 2020. And so it's it's I think it's definitely been a journey a lot from where it came, and there really is that high investment cost, and you know, you have a lot of kind of, I don't want to say dogmatic practices, but you know, at NASA we're diving 50% every day, and you're required a 1-hour check-in after you're done diving with the dive supervisor. But if you dive on air, there's no check-in. And so it's just different practices from people in creating the policies when they're not like divers. And so it's like that top-down approach versus kind of a bottom-up management. Well,
and part of it too is whether or not there's really need. Rebreathers, like open circuit, they're just tools.
Right.
And if you don't have a need for the tool, there's no need to go there. So some institutions are doing research that would benefit it. But some of the slides that you threw up earlier, like the slide of me cave diving in that last picture, looking at the geology, the picture that you threw up a couple slides ago with a pile of diving gear in front of me. That pile of dive gear, that was how much gear we needed for one dive. That's one dive's worth of gear.
Yeah.
It was in the Canary Islands in Spain, which are off the coast of Morocco, actually. And we were diving in a lava tube that was over a mile underwater at a maximum depth of 250 feet. And to do that on open circuit required tons and tons of gas. And that was what really got me interested in rebreathers to begin with, is my average cave dive was 5 cylinders. And my longer cave dives were 8 or more. And that's a pain in the butt.
Yeah, that's
the best way of describing it. And then, you know, sometimes we'd go through these caves and we'd go through these underwater passages. And like in this picture, this is my buddy, Dennis Williams, who I did a lot of my early work with. We would climb out of the water, get out of our gear, and go crawling through dry portions of the caves to get further into a cave system to another place where it get wet again. And so then you've got to drag all your gear behind you to be able to go diving where you'd found another batch of water, another water pool on the other side of these dry parts of the cave. And so open circuit just got to be prohibitive. It was just too difficult to be able to do effectively. And so I took a 1-year sabbatical from my cave diving work so that I could learn rebreathers. And that 1-year sabbatical turned into 4 years of doing research and development and learning more about it, to the point where I have pretty much dropped almost all of my open circuit diving completely. I mean, I rarely dive open circuit anymore, just because I find rebreathers offer a lot more flexibility and, in my perception, a lot more safety for the kind of work that I'm doing.
Yeah, I agree. And for for kind of expeditions like that, it's the rebreathers are a huge benefit because of the gas efficiency. Versus if you're, surveying in a 20-foot reef, it's actually more problematic to be using closed circuit, and you should probably be using a hookah, or another tool.
Yeah, and I used hookah in some of my work when I was doing my gold dredging in Bolivia, and my bachelor's thesis for my geology degree at Humboldt State University all dealt with settling rates of alluvial gold particles that I collected from the Trinity River up in Northern California. All that work was done on hookah. And so the trick with most scientific diving is matching the job to the proper tool to be able to let it get it done with the most efficacy and the least amount of risk.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the, a good scientist will do that versus, a lot of times a diver is kind of tempted because they're like, oh, they want the latest and greatest tools. They're like, oh man, it looks really good. But in reality, it's not the best, thing to be using.
Yeah.
So.
And the other thing that rebreathers offer, they offer a couple of other benefits for sciences in particular, but also for recreational divers. You've got the ability to be able to get close to some types of animals that you wouldn't be able to get close to normally. We did a project we were diving in Socorro, and then you've got a slide there. If you can pull it up, there's a picture of some sharks off in the distance. The picture is, we were there for a week and a half, and there were 23 open circuit divers, and I was the only one using a rebreather on the boat. We were on the Nautilus Explorer, which is a recreational boat, but I was doing scientific work on the trip. And most of the people there were recreational, so they were just diving scuba tanks. And the closest, the best picture that any of the open circuit divers were able to get of the shark was maybe 40 feet away. It's not a bad picture, but you didn't get close to it at all. And we were at a shark cleaning station at about 120 feet. Not the picture I'm looking for, but that's okay. We were at 120 feet observing these sharks at a shark cleaning station, all of us lined up on a ledge, looking out into the distance, into the blue, where these sharks were getting cleaned by fish in the area. As the open circuit divers ran short on gas, they would leave. And eventually, I'm the only one left on the bottom. And I can stay there because rebreathers, as you know, you've got a very long duration before you run out of gas. Well, 5 minutes after everybody's left, literally 5 minutes after everybody's left, I've got sharks bumping me. I mean, they're like literally all around me.
You're just another fish. You're not making any noise.
What's that?
You're just another fish. You're not making any noise. You know, you're pretty big, and so that bright yellow.
It's another fish. I just think I was another rock.
Big yellow rock.
So, and that's part of what is really, to me, exciting about rebreathers is the fact that I get to have interactions that I just have never had. I remember the first time I took a rebreather off Catalina, which is a little island off the coast of Los Angeles where I live. I've been diving Casino Point, which is a really popular spot, for 20 years. And it's a place that we take students to. It's a really popular place to go. And sometimes there's these school of bait fish that come swimming by. And it's pretty neat to see. Well, the first time I took a rebreather there, I'm swimming near the bait fish, and you can actually swim into the bait fish. So which you can't do in open circuit very effectively because they scatter you. But in a rebreather, you're not emitting bubbles. And so I'm inside these fish, and swimming in through these bait fish are tuna. I mean, these tuna that are feeding on the fish. And in 20 years of diving there, I'd never seen a tuna underwater. I've had friends that free dive for them and actually shoot them and have seen them, but I'd never seen one in scuba. And I'm not much of a free diver, so I'd never seen it. And here I am looking at these tuna feeding on the bait fish. I mean, it was really cool. You know, and there's a picture of, that's actually Forrest Goodyear, a good friend of mine who lives in the Florida Keys. We were diving off of Dominica, and we had sperm whales coming up to us in Dominica because we were diving rebreathers, and they would come right up to us. And I've had gray whales come up to me. I've had humpback whales come up to me. I've had juvenile humpback whales literally come and lay their head on my shoulder underwater. You know, and one time during a decompression stop, I had a 4.5 hour decompression stop after one of my dives. I had these two whales, a mother and a calf, spend 2 hours with me underwater.
Wow.
And you know when they left? They left when the first person on the surface put on a scuba tank and jumped in the water. They were underwater. They'd taken 3 breaths, and the whales were gone. Just gone.
Yeah. For every biologist, I tell every biologist, I was like, you have to get on closed circuit. You know, the animals, it's a completely different animal. You know, they're swimming all around you. I've had, you know, snappers, they'll just follow me the entire dive, and they'll come up by the loop and everything. And so it's a completely different experience.
Well, and Rich Pyle, a good friend of mine who lives in Hawaii, works at the Bishop Museum. Those are a picture of black sea bass here in Catalina, which a lot of times will come up to you on open circuit and then swim off. I've had them sitting 45 minutes rubbing their fins on my shoulder underwater. You know, it's just really fun. But Rich, who was one of the early pioneers in using rebreathers in the scientific community, mostly for deep water fish collection. But he talks about looking at fish behaviors that not only have never been observed, but he talks about some of the wrasses. I think they were wrasses. They might have been butterfly fish, but I'm not a fish guy, so you can't take anything I say about fish. You got to take it all with a grain of salt or a grain of salt water or something. But he talks about watching these fish mixing their eggs and sperm, and the eddies in the current formed behind his head, inches from his face, because he's diving on a rebreather. And normally you couldn't even get close enough to these fish to be able to see them.
Oh yeah, they'll just hide, and to be able to see behavior like that, that's incredible. And such, now you have to wonder if the data collected on Open Circuit, how accurate is it?
Well, it's funny. My son Evan, when he was 12, built his own rebreather.
Wow.
And he was doing a science fair project for school, and he was looking at exactly that issue. He did fish transects looking at calico bass here in Southern California, right off our local beach in Laguna Beach. And what he would do is he'd run transects on transect lines, and there's a picture of Evan in there someplace. You'll see us entering the water with his homemade rebreather. Yeah, there he is. That's Evan when he was 12. And he would do transects underwater on Open Circuit, and then he would go to beach. We'd switch into the rebreather. We'd run exactly the same transects underwater with rebreathers. And he did somewhere between 60 and 70 transects, I believe. It was a lot of data collection, especially for a 12-year-old.
There's a thesis right there at 12 years old.
and what he found was that he was seeing twice the number of calico bass on the same survey with rebreathers than he did with Open Circuit. And that was significant at the 0.005 level for those of you that like statistics out there.
Yeah.
And that's a kid that wasn't even in high school yet. The type of work that's out there is boundless for people that want to be able to do stuff underwater. That's actually a picture of my daughter when she got certified in Curacao. And I actually believe that by the time, there she is when she was 6 years old with her first rebreather. I don't see a reason why we don't expect to see kids in 5 years or 10 years diving on rebreathers and never diving Open Circuit at all.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious because that's a kind of a contested discussion, it'd be interesting because if you start on closed circuit and you kind of teach the practices from the beginning, kids are very smart, and it's like they should be able to catch on, and they'll be diving rebreathers almost exclusively from the beginning.
Well, kids are capable of doing a lot more than most adults give them credit for. My son's project at 12, he actually set a world record at 14 for being the first person to scuba dive on all 7 continents, because he used to go with me on my scientific diving expeditions, and I used to put him to work. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't do the same jobs as everybody else, but he could do work and collect useful information and useful data if you define the task narrowly enough and fit it within his skill set. And kids are like that. Kids like that. Kids like having a purpose. Kids like being trusted.
Exactly.
It really opened my eyes when I talked to him about it, because our mindset as a seasoned divers is that rebreathers are hard. Rebreathers are complex. Rebreathers are difficult. Rebreathers are dangerous. Mm-hmm. That's the way I learned about rebreathers. That's the message that I was given. And if you talk to most open water instructors who don't have rebreather background, they'll pretty much tell you the same thing. Yeah. What my son's perspective was when he learned these things at 12 years old? Dad, this is not any different than building a Lego set. And in fact, it's a lot easier in a lot of respects. Mm-hmm. And that really opened my eyes to the way that youth and the way that people that aren't brainwashed to think a certain way look at what the tasks actually are. And you know what? Evan was right. That's my son's name is Evan.
You don't have a lot of bad habits yet,
You don't have bad habits, and you haven't yet been trained to be afraid of something. And a lot of the
Right.
stuff, a lot of the issues we have are not so much that the technology is inherently dangerous or that the risks are inherently extreme. It's that the way we think about it is colored by other things that we already know. And because it's different than what we know, it's therefore scary.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of those biases kind of establish that it's like, oh, this is too much, this is too complicated, it's already over my head. I'm going to say no before I even entertain the thought. And versus someone that's younger, that they don't have these bad habits, these biases, they're just like, oh, cool, this is awesome. Well, okay, I just got to keep my mouth here and keep open and closed. And so,
now, mind you, as a parent, I have to say, sometimes I'm pretty darn terrified when I watch my kids do the things they do. And I'm terrified when I watch other kids do things. I mean, I look at some of the skateboarding these kids do, and I look at some of the mountain biking they do, and I put my head in my hands and I shake myself and I try not to think about it. But
yeah, exactly. You know, I see kind of like whitewater kayaking, the mountain biking. I'm like, people say cave diving is the most dangerous sport. I was like, no. I was like, mountain biking on these ridges, or, you know, whitewater kayaking where you miss your line, you're going to be held underwater. I mean, there's so many other risks, but those risks are considered okay because they're known.
Well, and the potential is that people hurt themselves or people get killed, and that happens. And it's unfortunate when it happens, but I don't think that that's a reason to avoid doing something. I mean, it's with youth, you've got to at least temper their enthusiasm with a little bit of judgment, because many youth don't have the judgment. And that's one of the things that I had to do with Evan. You know, he would have moved much faster than I allowed him to, because he wanted to do all the really fun, exciting stuff right away. And I appreciate that. I want to do all the fun, exciting stuff. But kids are immortal.
Yeah, they don't know what they don't know. And so, I mean, at least I know my judgment has changed a lot since, you know, just growing up more in diving. And so, you know, I slow down in it. And so I can imagine if you have access to all these resources, you just want to sprint. And, you know, I see folks that have been diving only a couple of years and they're already cave diving to the back of, you know, the line at Ginny with they've got, you know, scooters, rebreathers, and now bailout rebreathers. And so it's
I wrote an article, I was going to say a couple of years ago, it's probably 15 or 20 by now, called Too Far, Too Soon. And the whole premise of the article is that technology was allowing divers to progress to points that were far beyond perhaps where it was prudent to be. And yet, part of me is saying, I'm a hypocrite. Because I'm basing that on my judgment and how long it took me to get to the point where I would do those types of dives, which was, in some cases, decades. And like you said, some of these people are doing these dives after a year or 2 years. And so,
very rapidly.
In some respects, I wonder, am I preaching one thing and not really allowing it on the other hand? I mean, technology really has become far stabler in the last 15 years, rebreathers in particular. And there's part of me that doesn't trust it as much as perhaps somebody who's just learned rebreathers in the last year or two on newer systems and have never had to experience the kinds of failures that I used to go through on a regular basis when I started to dive the technology.
Yeah, you've seen the changes, and then you also see, like, I mean, I was discussing this yesterday, that, you know, how often are you seeing these failures in the rebreathers, and then you become complacent so quickly. You know, it's how often are people, you know, getting a flooded unit and getting a caustic? How often? And so, how often are you having a complete electronics failure? And so you have that shifting baseline of the acceptable risk, and so.
And that's exactly what's going on. Their experience base is different than mine. You know, when I started diving rebreathers, I don't think it would be a much of an exaggeration to say that every night I was fixing something. I was soldering wires on a circuit board. I was fixing sensors in the head. I was fixing connectors that went to the handset. I was fixing leaks in the counterlungs. I was fixing adapters or O-rings that sealed the system. There was always something wrong in the systems that I were diving. Yeah. They failed every dive, literally. And your diving was an exercise in managing failures. And that just doesn't really happen like it used to. That doesn't happen very commonly anymore. And so maybe they are right to be able to do what they're doing. It's just that my experience base is different, and I tend to be a bit more cautious, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I know our mutual friend Greg Stanton. He's been diving a little while as well, and he's saying, yeah, back in the day, your buddies saved your life. It happened pretty often, and so it's like, oh wow, that's not in my experience. It's a little bit different in that, and so, but that's how we perceive the risk based off of our experiences, and so how accurate is that?
Well, that comes down to what's happening in the community as well. I spent a good 20 years collecting and evaluating cave diving fatality data. And I'm not as active in that now as I used to be, but I used to be pretty proactive in trying to trace that information down. And then I started doing the same thing with rebreathers. And what I found was that up until the 70s, most of the people that died, well, nobody had training because training didn't exist. But most of the people that died had no idea what it was they were doing. Into the 80s, you found that the people that died were people that had no training, and the people that lived, had gotten cave diving training, were pretty safe. And then by the time we got to the late 80s and went into the 90s and the 2000s, that kind of shifted. And the people that were dying were people that had training in cave and cavern diving, more so than the people that didn't. And the reason for that was, first of all, training was more available, so people were able to get training. And so the people that were interested in that activity usually had some type of training available to them. But most of them were progressing beyond the levels of where they had been trained. And the other thing that was happening simultaneously is that the landowners in many of the places where we had caves were becoming more cognizant of what the issues were and the problems, and they were controlling access to many of the sites that were commonly used much better. And so the people that didn't have training weren't able to actually get into them, or were limited by the type of equipment they were not allowed to carry. For example, we didn't let them carry lights. They followed the no lights rule. They couldn't go into the caves because they couldn't get in far enough because they couldn't see. And so between closing off the environments to people that were ill prepared, and then making training more available to those that were interested, there was a shift over time in terms of the populations that were dying from people that didn't have training to people that did. And those sorts of things are, in my view, my opinion, true of all the avenues of technical diving. And really for open circuit diving as well. If you go back far enough, most people that died in just scuba tank diving were untrained, or had less than a dozen dives under their belt. And then there was another peak as you got people that had 7, 8, 10 years of experience. When they start doing more edgy kind of diving, they start pushing their own personal boundaries and their own personal comfort levels. And the same thing is true in the technical diving industry. There's accidents in that first period of time when you've just learned, or perhaps haven't actually finished training yet and you are going out anyways and doing it. And then there's another big bump after you've got a certain amount of experience, and now you start pushing environmental limits and going deeper or staying longer. And when you say complacency kills, that's really the issue of where I look at it, is those folks that feel like they're ready to move on and yet may not really be ready to move on and not be aware of it in themselves.
And there's that danger in, like, you've never had a problem. You've never had a problem with your unit. You never had a problem with, your equipment, and it's been okay. So you get more confident, and then you run into a failure and you're pushed at the kind of the limits of, in the environment, and then you have an equipment problem there. And so or you have a skill related problem or something as you're pushing your luck. And so, yeah.
So we've been focusing on all the negative sides on this and not very much the positive,
Yeah.
And we haven't talked much at all about my expeditions. You want to throw on some slides and we can kind of go through some of that stuff, because I feel that we started on a segue and we never got off of it.
I mean, that's okay. That's why it's Dive Talks. And so, let's talk about your first expedition in the Antarctic, and I believe, was it 89? I don't know if that was your first or.
That was actually my first time in 1989. And it was actually, I had just come back from diving in the Red Sea. I'd spent the summer of 89 working with the Multinational Force and Observers, which was the UN peacekeeping force, training dive instructors out there, because all these soldiers were out in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula and not able to do anything recreationally because they couldn't go anywhere. And yet there was this huge, beautiful ocean around them. And so they decided that they would train instructors to go there. And it was warm. I was there in July and August, and there were some of the canyons we were in where the air temperatures were in excess of 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know what that was in centigrade for our non-US friends. Let me see. I can probably figure that out here really quickly.
Close to 40?
Yeah. It's got to be more than 40, I think.
I think so too.
135 minus 50. Equals 85.
Yeah, so some of the work in the Antarctic, I mean, that's something that I've been wanting to push, at least in my personal diving or personal, adventures. But Becky Schott, she joins us pretty often on this, and she's pulled back some amazing pictures of the biology out there. And when you would go down kind of in the late 80s, early 90s. How much was known about the biology and ecology there?
A pretty fair amount. They actually started working in the Antarctic underwater during the International Geophysical Year in 1957, 1958.
Wow.
And the work actually was done there by one of my mentors, John Resick Jr., who was the head of the program at Santa Ana College. That was one of the reasons I first put Antarctica on my list as wanting to go down to. And so he spent the years down there free diving underneath the ice to be able to do collection work.
Wow.
He was actually the national spearfishing champion in the United States in 1953 and again in 1955.
I mean, I can't imagine the neoprene you wear and the weight to do it. And so
all that stuff. And so he would hold his breath and go and do work. And then starting in the 60s, Paul Dayton and other folks worked all through the 60s diving open circuit, doing biological research down there. And in those days, when I went down there originally, all of the work that we were doing was working with double hose regulators, because those had the best anti-freeze characteristics of any of the work we had, of any of the equipment we had. One of the early things I did was started studying the effectiveness of single hose regulators underneath the ice in polar diving conditions. And it wasn't just putting a regulator in a tank of cold water and seeing if it worked. It was actually putting them on divers and looking at what kind of failure rates we had with different types of equipment over the course of 1,200 dives.
Wow.
And so it was operationally based. We had problems as we were going through it. We would deal with those problems, and I would record all of those, and we'd come up with procedures and recommendations as to what to use, what not to use, how to use it, how not to use it.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that work is being done biologically at the same time. There's a shot of me diving underneath an iceberg off of the Antarctic Peninsula in Palmer Station, which is one of the two major major coastal bases that the United States has. The larger base was McMurdo, and when I landed in McMurdo in 1989, I went from 135 degree temperatures in the Sinai to minus 20 degrees temperatures in the Antarctic. So there was a big difference in what it was like to go from one environment straight to the other. And I knew nothing about diving in Antarctica. I was attending a chamber technician certification program when somebody in the audience stood up and said, "Hey, we're looking for someone to go run the dive operations in Antarctica. Is there anybody here that'd be interested in going?" And I raised my hand and I said, I talk about it, but I had a management consulting company. I wasn't really interested in going to Antarctica for 6 months at that point in time. Although I wanted to hear more about it because my friend John Resick, had told me so much about it. Well, because of my cave diving background and the fact that I had significant experience in working in overhead environments, they liked me as a candidate. And we continued to talk, and eventually they talked me into going down there and spending 6 months helping them run the dive operations. I became the dive locker technician, and my job was to support the teams of diving scientists that were down there with their diving. And we had about 20 scientists that came through during the season, and my job was to fill tanks, maintain regulators, make sure things are working, keep them serviced, and keep them in the field and getting their research done. But at the same time, it allowed me an opportunity to go diving as well, to be able to see what life was down there, to be able to take photographs, and to be able to start collecting and doing my own research, looking at different types of opportunities. And I did work in regulator effectiveness. I also did work in using dive computers down there, which hadn't been studied at all, and looking at how well they worked and what kind of data we were, how that differed from usage in more temperate climates.
I can't think of a better way to gain that kind of experience.
Well, and it was an exciting time for me personally, because I was doing new stuff and we were learning new information. We were getting information that helped other diving scientists that have helped them for decades. Mastro and I wrote the first diving manual for diving in the Antarctic, called the Antarctic Scientific Diving Manual at that point in time. Then he and I alternated seasons on the ice for the first couple of years, where we would trade off our positions. And so we both had substantial experience in working down there, and we collaborated on what we had each learned and put it all in a manual that was then updated by Rob Robbins years later. And Rob's been down there longer than any of us. He started down there as a commercial diving person, working both Palmer and McMurdo, and has since taken over the job as scientific diving coordinator, where he's been, I think Rob's been working down there for 40 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. He'd be a great person to have on your talk show if you ever had the chance.
Yeah, I might have to peg him on to come join us and tell some stories. And so,
and part of the neat part about working as a coordinator down there and not as a scientist is that I got to work in a lot of different projects. So there's a slide that, if you can find it, that shows a picture of a flat ice field in the foreground and like a glacier in the background, a cliff with a cliff. Well, that's a shot of Mount Erebus. We were on Ross Island, which is where McMurdo Station is. There's a penguin rookery in the foreground, a colony, and in the background is Mount Erebus, which is an active volcano. You can see the steam plume coming off the top. So that's where we were located. Not the slide I'm looking for. Go forward, go another couple of slides forward in the program I sent you, the deck.
Yeah. We had so many pictures that we had to go through, and I was trying to find, I was like, okay, maybe this one will work. And so
Yeah. As he's set up with the PowerPoint slides, can he just flip through them so I can direct him where to go?
Yeah, I had to make them into images. And
never mind then. Okay. So, any rate, one of the projects we did, we were actually working in one of the freshwater lakes on the continent of Antarctica itself. So most of our diving was done from Ross Island, which is a little island in the Ross Sea, which is where most of the historic Antarctic expeditions took place. It started from Amundsen's expedition and Scott's expeditions, where Shackleton had worked. But we weren't on Antarctica, the continent. So this particular project was being run by scientists from Woods Hole, and we were on the continent itself, diving from a freshwater lake, and the ice cover in the freshwater lake was 23 to 25 feet thick.
Wow.
And so the first thing we had to do was to be able to get to the water from the ice. And we did that by taking a copper coil, that had hot glycol, hot antifreeze circulating through it. And we would lower this coil, hopefully flat, with the hot antifreeze, and it would melt the water, and we'd pump the water out until we ended up with a hole. So similar to the hole that you see here, although this is actually a hole on the sea ice that we actually make by drilling with a giant auger bit, because the ice here is only about 8 feet thick. And so we can take a drill and drill hole, but where the freshwater lake is we couldn't get the augers or the equipment in that we needed to use to be able to do that. And so it would take us 24 to 48 hours to melt these holes through the ice. And then what we do is I would put on a scuba tank and slip through the hole out underneath the ice, where I'm now in the lake with 25 feet of ice above my head. And the water layers there are stratified, not unlike the caves that I used to dive in the Bahamas and Mexico were stratified, with different water chemistries in each one. Well, the average air temperature in Antarctica on the continent ranges, close to about minus 70 degrees. If you average it out, between minus 20 and minus 70 over the course of the year. The average temperature on Mars is pretty similar at the equators there. And when we go to Mars in person, I mean, we're already on Mars. We're already on Mars with all kinds of robots and stuff. I think it's really cool.
When we get manned to Mars.
When we get manned to Mars, we're already looking for life. But when we get manned to Mars, we want to know where to go looking to be able to see where we're going to find it. And the thought was, there's life in Antarctica. There's some really cryptic life that lives down there. There's algae that lives inside rocks, in the layer below the surface of the rocks, inside the rock itself, where there's some protection from the temperature and the environmental changes that would take place on the surface, called cryptoendolithic algae.
Wow.
Another place that we find life is underneath these freshwater lakes, under 25 feet of ice. And at the bottom of the lake is a mat, a bacterial mat, that's releasing gases, releasing oxygen, and algae that are photosynthesizing and releasing bubbles of oxygen off of them as they photosynthesize during the summer. And
you're able to get enough light during the summertime?
Only in the summer, because in the darkness, in the wintertime, there's nothing.
Nothing.
And so here's a species of life that's managed to evolve to be able to live in a place where it's dark 6 months of the year. And light only part of the year, covered with ice, in a place where there's no heat whatsoever. And that pretty much describes what Mars is like.
Yeah, that's another planet.
What this group of scientists from Woods Hole were doing was studying this as an analog environment for a place where we might be able to find something similar on Mars, and where we might be able to find something still alive. And I love science because I love those stories. It's like, where do we have here on Earth that's like someplace different?
It gives us a great leverage or a tool to where are we going to look? Well, when we get to Mars or another planet, where are we going to look? And now this gives us like you say, an analog of where we can look, because we find life existing in such extreme conditions here. So
it gives us a starting point.
Exactly.
Dale Anderson, who I met down in Antarctica in 1989, he goes down every year and studies the Dry Valley Lakes, not only in the area near McMurdo, but he actually goes to the Dry Valley Lakes in the area south of Africa as well. And he's been studying these for years. And he worked out of Ames, one of NASA's laboratories, in an exobiology program. And I just, to me, I think there's nothing more exciting than being able to go out and find things that people haven't seen before, whether it's in underwater caves, or it's underneath the ice, or it's diving deep. To me, that's what drives me. It's like, I love being able to learn something that we didn't know. It's the most romantic part of science in my mind. It's being able to do what Charles Darwin did, and go out and actually collect stuff that people haven't seen. And that's still going on. And that's what drives me. That's what I love about what goes on in science. It's going and seeing stuff that perhaps people have seen it and not described it. Perhaps it hasn't been seen before ever at all. And there's lots of opportunity to be able to do that. And that's one of the advantages that people that are in the sciences now have, is that there are new technologies that are available to be able to allow us to access these sites, like rebreathers, that we just couldn't get to before. And so there's a whole host of new things that we're going to be able to learn that 40 years ago you couldn't, because you just couldn't get there.
Yeah, we couldn't get there. And several years ago in 2016, you were part of an expedition that went and tested the rebreathers in the different environments in the Antarctic.
John Heine, who's the current scientific diving officer for the Office of Polar Programs in the National Science Foundation, put together a research grant to be able to go down and study rebreathers and the use of rebreathers in Antarctica. That in the U.S. program, there had been nothing done. The Kiwis, the New Zealanders, had used Draeger dolphins to a limited extent in Scott Base, which is not far from McMurdo, over a couple seasons. The Italians had used rebreathers in a very limited fashion in one of their research stations. Mm-hmm. And there were some film crews that had very limited experience in filming some natural history documentaries. But there was no codified approach to using rebreathers down there, and not a very good understanding of operational parameters or what might work and what might not work. So John put together a program, a grant, to be able to go down and study the use of rebreathers within the U.S. Antarctic program and actually start collecting some data. And so he put together a team based with myself, Christian McDonald, who is the diving officer for Scripps Institution. Let's see, who else? Rob Robbins, who is the on-site scientific diving coordinator, and his partner, Steve Rupp, was down there. We also had a couple of other people as well. I'd have to go and look at the pictures. But at any rate, the point is we took a wide variety of rebreathers down there and utilized them and systematically looked at what kinds of problems we had, what worked, what didn't work, with a view of how they could be implemented operationally into ongoing research programs for use in Antarctica with the U.S. Scientific diving program there, in the U.S. Antarctic program. And it was pretty successful. We had some systems that we were more challenged than others in terms of their responses to the environmental conditions we had. We found that some environmental conditions didn't work with any of the rebreathers that we had. We had to modify our diving procedures to be able to utilize them effectively. But we developed, we got to a point where we were able to dive most of the time without problems and be able to conduct dives, which means that in the future we could be conducting actual scientific work with the rebreathers and be able to get things done that you couldn't do otherwise. And that's what we were there for, and we were successful in that.
Yeah, congratulations on that. And what kind of conditions were, so extreme that none of the units would be able to function in?
Well, I think probably the most interesting thing that I learned, we typically used to transport our dive gear in the back of flatbed trucks, essentially. We would use tractored vehicles that had an enclosed cabin that the people would sit in. We would drive sometimes, 5, 10, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours away, and the dive gear sat in the back. And the dive gear years ago was just exposed to the environment. And open circuit gear could pretty much take that. You couldn't put regulators on in those temperatures because the O-rings weren't flexible enough. They'd be too brittle to be able to seal. But if you put everything together before you left, you could drive out there and everything worked fine. I think the first thing that I learned with rebreathers that really shocked the hell out of me, pardon the French, is that when I went to open the mouthpiece was frozen shut. We couldn't move it. We couldn't turn it. And for those of you who don't use rebreathers, it's a barrel inside another barrel that is designed to be able to insulate the. I'm picking up an echo now.
Yeah, a little echo.
You're picking up an echo too. At any rate, there are a barrel inside another barrel that prevent water from going into the rebreather when you're not breathing it. And typically in part of the checklist procedures, when you put these rebreathers together, you breathe on the rebreather a couple times to be able to make sure that all the electronics are functioning and the gas is circulating properly and that the sensors are actually giving you the information that appears to be correct. Mm-hmm. Just the moisture and the gas that we exhaled going into the area between the two barrels and the air temperatures that we had outdoors would freeze, and then they wouldn't function at all. And so there's an example of a unit that I've been using for an hour outside. I closed the mouthpiece, I walked away, I came back an hour later, put it back in my mouth, and just thought I'd be able to open it and start breathing again, because I wanted to see what the scrubber would do, the chemical that actually removes the carbon dioxide. And I couldn't get to that part of the experiment because I couldn't open the mouthpiece. So that was an aha moment for me, because it was something that none of us really expected to see. And yet it was so integral to being able to use rebreathers in the Antarctic that it was like a hard stop. And so that's an example. That was me sitting outside, outdoors for an hour and minus 15 degree temperatures, just breathing on the rebreather to see how the electronics function and how the scrubber, the chemical absorbent, function in cold temperatures on the surface before we even went in the water. And so our research protocols were built in little steps to where we started in the surface and then worked our ways into the water on shallow dives and then on longer, deeper dives, working our way through to repetitive dives and seeing how things worked. And eventually what we found is that in order to be able to have any system reliability at all, the only dives that we were pretty much assured of having a sure dive and not having a failure were the dives that took place from the heated huts that most of our diving down there takes place from anyways. Like basically plywood huts with heaters in them, with holes drilled in the floor that allowed us access to the water. And when we were diving in those kinds of conditions, even though the water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 2 degrees centigrade, the water conditions were less important than the surface conditions before we actually went diving. If we could get those units into the water and functional, underwater, they worked fine.
Now, what about after the dive? If you're doing multiple, dives, is it just a single dive a day?
No, we actually did repetitive dives. But again, as long as we kept the units warm between dives and didn't allow them to freeze, we were okay. And we had other protocols that we followed too. Like we followed longer pre-breathing standards than you might for normal open water diving down there to make sure that the scrubber bed was effectively warmed and operating efficiently before we went diving. There's a Poseidon Rebreather, which is one of the different types of rebreathers that we use down there. I think that picture's of Steve Rupp. And I think we conducted 117 dives over the course of the research season that we were down there while we were diving the systems. And we dove 15 different systems, I think, or variations on different systems. And the whole idea was to see not just if one system would work, but if we could get multiple systems that are working down there, because researchers are using different types of systems around the world. We didn't want to have all of our data on just one type of unit. We wanted to get data from multiple units because we wanted to be able to provide as broad-based opportunity for research support as we possibly could.
And I'm curious about, because I think this is kind of going to be the newer, kind of next limitations in this type of stuff is that thermal stress in terms for dry suits, the diver getting cold. How long are you guys diving? Because at least I saw that with the folks that are diving in Pearce Resurgence. They're, the thermal problems are a very serious one. If you have a dry suit failure and you get cold, I mean, that's can be a catastrophic problem.
Well, that's when I talk about being able to get to environments we couldn't see before, couldn't access for a significant period of time, those are the kinds of things we're talking about. When I started diving, our average dive constraints, even here in California, where the waters were temperate. And that was even more true back in the 60s when people from Scripps and UCLA started research diving. And wetsuits extended our period to be able to spend longer time underwater doing work. Dry suits extended that even further. Then we were limited by air, and we started using double cylinders to be able to get around those limitations. And at that point in time, we were limited by dive time and dive tables. And dive computers helped us tremendously in that respect. And then we got to the point where my average dive was running 4 hours. And we're back to gas limitations again. And rebreathers have solved that problem. I've done 8-hour research dives where I've been able to go underwater and spend an entire day working underwater. In 1960, that was pretty much unfathomable.
It's a work day, yeah.
That's a work day. And you're right, now we're temperature limited. And there are new things that are happening that will get around some of those problems. We've got electrically heated undergarments that are solving some of those problems.
Mm-hmm.
We had hot water suits that allowed commercial divers to do it, but scientific divers need a lighter base. They don't have the infrastructure to be able to use everything that's required to run a hot water suit to get work done.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there are new insulative materials that are coming out, aerogels that are being worked on by DUI, Diving Unlimited International, which is a dry suit and insulation manufacturer in Southern California. Those types of new materials will extend our opportunities. Electrically heated undergarments will provide backups for if we have dry suit failures and water leaks. So
Mm-hmm.
You're right. None of this stuff takes place by itself. These are all incremental things that are going on in different avenues of technology as we go forth. We couldn't move far enough underwater to be able to get to where we needed to go. And scooters and dive propulsion vehicles have modified that. I don't think any of these tools are satisfactorily developed, quite frankly. And another problem that we have right now is the problem with underwater navigation. Our technology in underwater navigation, quite frankly, sucks. We're diving essentially the same kind of navigational tools now that we had in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that offers a huge avenue of places where we can have significant advances in technology that would allow us to be able to get to research sites that we can't get to effectively right now, with the amount of risk that's associated with them, because we just can't navigate back and forth well enough to get there. Those are all areas that I see where we're going to have continued improvements to be able to do this kind of work. And so your comment about the Pearce Resurgence, which is in New Zealand, it's a cave opening in New Zealand, for those of you who don't know it, where they're diving cold water temperatures. I think water temperatures like 42 degrees where the water comes out. That's a hard environment to work with when you're diving to depths in excess of 150 feet, because there's so much time you have to spend on decompression on the way out to be able to come up safely. And so a thermal failure there is very worrisome. It's a strong concern. And diving in Antarctica for longer periods of time, we have the same issues. Our typical dive is 45 minutes. And we come out not because we run out of gas. We come out because it's not safe for us to stay any longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so your point's well taken. We've got to have all of this equipment developed in parallel. We need advances in not just rebreathers, but in thermal insulation and navigation and electronics to be able to move to the next level, to be able to get to those new environments, to be able to get new work done.
Yeah, and that's and with that kind of innovation, we can go farther. And so it's navigation. That's something I didn't really think of, how we're still using compasses, and and it is pretty Stone Age, or at least it's pretty old. So it needs to evolve a little bit. So.
Yep, and there are people trying. There's stuff out there that's going on.
but
when I look at now, I've been really fortunate. I've been really, really lucky to be able to go out and see the places I've been. I've been really fortunate to be able to ride a wave of technology development. First in caves, and then in different gases, and then in rebreathers. I've ridden a technological wave that isn't my doing. I've learned from other people. I've done stuff that I've taken what other people have developed and applied it in a different way. And it's gotten me to I've gotten to go to lots of places around the world. I never would have guessed when I was in college that I was going to get to participate in diving expeditions all around the planet. I never would have guessed I'd been down to Antarctica, a dozen times. I love what I've gotten to do. But the people that are in school now have exactly the same opportunity. The people that are in research programs and graduate programs now, those opportunities are still there. Those opportunities to go to new places are still there. Those opportunities to apply new developments and equipment to get to places that haven't been studied are still there. And you guys are really lucky. I'm a little bit jealous because I'm an old fart, and my day is done. I've had my day in the sun, and I'm still doing stuff, but quite frankly, I don't have the degree of I don't have the balls, I guess, is what I'm about to say, to go out and do some of the stuff to push the new frontiers that are still there. That's one of the disadvantages of getting older and realizing one's mortality is existent. But there's a lot of new opportunity to go out and do exploration that I'm jealous. It's just, I just think it's really exciting, and I think people have an opportunity to go out and do this stuff that we're still going to continue to learn, and you're still going to continue to grow, and take advantage of it, embrace it. That's all I can say.
Good words. There's still so much to see and find and explore, and so people are finding new things even in one of the most cave dove areas here in North Florida. They're still finding new cave and whatnot, and so yeah, completely echo that. There's so much exploration and there's so much to be seen still.
You don't have to go to Antarctica where this picture's taken. I did some dives not long ago, maybe 5 years ago, off of West Palm Beach, and discovered a new species of black coral a mile offshore. In West Palm Beach, where there are thousands of people scuba diving all the time. Wow. Yeah. There's lots of new things yet to be found.
Well, that's it. I think that's a kind of a great way to end it, because there's so much. It's very exciting, and things are only getting better. And so you get to have adventures like this, and it comes from being open to the opportunity and looking for it as well. And so,
well, I wish you all luck. All of you most of you on board here are probably scuba divers. That's probably why you're here, would be my guess. Take these lessons to heart. Continue to learn, continue to develop your own skills, and by all means, try not to go too fast. Try to develop the foundation you need to be able to do this with a reasonable degree of risk before you go, because there's a lot of time left in your lives to be able to enjoy the many wonders that we have on our planet. And go ahead and do so safely, and hopefully I'll look forward to seeing you guys underwater some point in time.
Exactly. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Geoff. It's been a privilege. Hopefully we can have you again soon. And, we're supposed to be diving right now, but we'll be going diving soon, right?
I hope so. Thanks for having me, and take care, and we'll chat again.
Of course, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us on this week's Divesoft Dive Talks Live. And don't forget to like and share, and join us next week. We have a good Gear Talks episode on Tuesday and a awesome Dive Talks episode next Thursday. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.